Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be listening to the 11th part of What If Deku Was in Villain Class 1A. If you enjoy, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing down below, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you get notified when videos go live. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Chapter 25, What Am I to You? Has he found the kid? Not yet. Shigaraki growled under his breath, lowering his set of binoculars as he scratched at the dry skin on his neck absently with his free hand. Nothing about his plan had gone right. He needed that kid, Shoto Todoroki. Once All Might was out of the way, the son of the replacement number 1 would be needed to take Endeavor down too. Shigaraki wanted to leave a scar on society larger than any it had laid on him. This whole world was full of fakes. Fake smiles, fake morals, fake promises, fake heroes. That's why he wanted Stain on his side. But the idiot took one look at the tattered All Might poster on the wall of the dingy bar the League of Villains had claimed as their own, at the tears through it and splattered blood, and had decided that their goals did not align. Righteous bastard, and he was all the media cared about. Beforehand, Shigaraki had encountered Dabi, the infamous villain who had set young Todoroki off on the path to villainy in the first place. Shigaraki had been bitter at first. He wanted control, but this Dabi guy just laughed in his face, seemed to think that the League was joining him, rather than him joining the League. It had taken some convincing on Kurogiri's part to let Dabi tag along. At least he was doing what he was supposed to do, unlike Stain and that irritating brat, Shoto. He hadn't followed them at the USJ, and now he was finally free from that wretched school. Shoto still seemed to believe the League were the bad guys in his story. All because of that quirkless little president of theirs. Oh, he was an interesting piece. The very thought made a smile creep across his face. Shigaraki hadn't expected it then, back at the USJ when Nomu almost snapped the boy like a twig, but Midoriya had some special skills that no quirk could grant. It was clear why he was in UA, the kid knew it too. The reasons, alone, were all fleeting and difficult to comprehend, but the conclusion was obvious. Left to his own devices, Izuku Midoriya would rise up as one of the biggest threats Hero Society ever faced, something of society's own doing. It was so poetic. Shigaraki needed that piece. He'd told Sensei so. He'd replied with the usual. Whatever Shigaraki wanted, he would receive, eventually. But the longer he waited, the more UA would corrupt him. He was a bonus character, a cheat code, something that, if he were to unlock within the time limit, would guarantee his victory. Left too long, however, and his chances dwindled. Not that it mattered now, of course. Right now, Shigaraki was standing on a rooftop, glaring down at the city of Hosu. The plan was this: Dabi would coax Shoto out of his prison-like home, and Kurogiri would warp them to their meeting place in Hosu. Dabi had requested that it would be Hosu. Shigaraki only agreed because then he'd be able to find the hero killer, Stain, in the same time frame. Moreover, Dabi and Shoto would run amok in the city for a short period of time, just to freak out the heroes a bit, stop them from hunting Stain. This of course, didn't go to plan, because Shoto took one look at the League and bolted. Kurogiri had offered to teleport the boy back, but Dabi insisted he'd go after him, make sure he was spotted once or twice to lure Endeavor over, not that Shigaraki cared. Whilst they were gone, Shigaraki met with the hero killer, a meeting that, evidently, didn't go so well. After teleporting back to Hosu again, in a fit of rage, Shigaraki requested that Sensei would send him more Nomua, 3 of them. He'd release them on the city, stand on the rooftops and watch it all burn by his hands. The media wouldn't blink at Stain's actions after the havoc that Shigaraki caused. They'd finally learn to treat him with some respect, unlike Stain. But Dabi still wasn't back with his stupid prodigy. This was getting ridiculous. Might I suggest we go somewhere more undercover? Kurogiri told him as the distant blades of a helicopter sent its distinct sound through the canopy of this concrete jungle. Almost shaking with rage, Shigaraki tossed his binoculars off the rooftop, watching them fall into the dark depths of the city below. The action pulled at his arms, the bullet wound still tender and sore, the pain fresh. It was made far worse by the cuts that Stain left. As the sound of the helicopter drew ever closer, Shigaraki grudgingly complied, "We're going after Dabi. I don't care if he doesn't have the kid." The two disappeared in a whirl of violet fog, captured distantly by the reporter sitting in that helicopter. This was how Aitsu would die. victim to his mistakes, ignorance, and rage. The world was blurry not only because his glasses lay out of his reach, broken beyond repair, but because of the tears that burned his cheeks, filling his eyes and running like waterfalls. Stupid, stupid. He should have listened to Midoriya. Oh, Midoriya, a friend unlike any other. The boy had some interesting ideals, some questionable motives and state of mind. He had a long way to go at UA, but his improvement was paramount. Perhaps Aiza really had called him in hopes that he'd be able to change his mind, but Aiza was blind. The sanity that had made him pick up the phone was gone before Midoriya had a chance to answer. It was back now, too little, too late. How he could have thought that he could take down Stain alone, was now beyond him. The man had hurt countless heroes already, including his brother. Why did Aiza think he'd be any better? The answer to how he did this was now clear. Stain had a paralysis quirk. Aiza had found him in an alleyway surprisingly close to the center of town, appearing a little disorientated and lost. Aiza brushed his own confusion aside as he yelled his reasoning at the villain, who simply stared at him whilst he tried to make out his face in the dark. It didn't take long to realize who Aiza was. Stain had sighed, ignoring Aiza's words as he tossed a knife that schemed past his cheek. Aiza was too quick to fall for a trick like that. Stain stalked him for a moment more, Aiza refusing to get any closer to him. They circled each other. Stain picked up his discarded knife, and by then, it was all over. The droplets of blood on that blade, that was all it took. When it reached the villain's tongue, Aiza felt his whole body seize up. He fell to the ground, glasses clattering on the concrete. Stain stood on them for good measure as he recited his own reasonings. And now, Stain stood above Aiza, his heavy boot on his back, pressing him into the ground, sword raised high. Aiza clenched his eyes shut. He felt something from that sword drip onto his back, and he realized in a moment of abject horror, that Stain had attacked someone else that night, that the blood was still fresh. All Aiza had done, was add to that list of death. That was his legacy. He was an idiot. Some vice president he was. As if he thought he could ever be the class representative. It was shameful. He couldn't compare to Midoriya, and certainly not that of the hero course, like Kendo. He didn't deserve it. He never would. And what do we have here? Aiza opened his eyes again. It was futile, for he couldn't see a thing. But at the end of the alley, he could just about make out the two blurry figures that Stain was addressing. A bubble of hope rose in Aiza's chest, one which he quickly swallowed. Whoever they were, they would only make things worse. They didn't look like heroes, not brightly colored nor spouting words of heroic justice. But they took a fighting stance. With a sob, Aiza realized he'd be the fault of their deaths. "Step away from my friend," the shorter of the two proclaimed. Aiza's breath hitched. He knew that voice. "Midoriya," he stammered. "What are you doing?" "Saving you, idiot," he yelled. Aiza furiously blinked the water from his eyes in an attempt to make his vision clearer. It barely did a thing, but now he knew the context. The identity of the figure beside Midoriya was clear. It only took one look at his red and white hair. It was Shoto. There were about a million questions buzzing through Aiza's mind by this point, but he knew this was not the time to ask any of them. Right now, all he could feel was the horror of the two of them dying at Stain's hands, because of him. "No," he croaked, "get away." "I know who you are," Stain said slowly, lifting his boot off Aiza's back and trudging towards them, footfalls heavy, echoing around them. Aiza desperately tried to get up, but it was no use. "More UA kids," the villain grumbled. "Class 1A, villain kids." "Yeah, that's what everyone says," Midoriya replied daringly. Aiza couldn't hope to describe the look on his face, but he could guess from the tone of his voice, from the slight tremor, a toxic mix of fear and unadulterated rage. Aiza knew it all too well, but the context here was far more valiant than Aiza's own. Stain studied the two for a moment. Once upon a time, the Class 1A system was a step in the right direction. Now its purpose is nothing more than fear-mongering. You have done nothing to help this. Heroes, villains, they're all the same. Power-hungry. Heroes have become ignorant to the world they pledged to save. They build towers plated with gold, raising themselves up higher, not caring about those who fall through the cracks, at least, not until they become strong enough to climb back up again. Those heroes use the bodies of their fallen foes to build their prideful towers even higher. The only way to stop it is to cut them down. Aiza glared over at Midoriya, praying he wasn't about to say something reckless and stupid. Yeah, but murder's bad. Oh, my god. Stain started to step closer. In the meantime, Midoriya took a cautious step back. Shoto stood strong and defiant. Why, you know you're right, Midoriya quickly added. More than anyone else, we know that. If you know who we are, then you know what we've done. And I agree with you, everything you've said. But the one thing you haven't considered is the fact that the people you're murdering do actually help people. And sure, they're not really doing it for the right reasons, but they are saving lives. Killing them is, by consequence, killing the people they would have saved. He was speaking very fast now. Stain was getting closer. Have you considered air, instead of chopping down the pillars, are raising the ground level? Only for the heroes to rise even higher again. Well, chopping them down has the same consequence. I prune the faults of society. You're arguing with me about morality and you're about to kill an innocent kid. Midoriya yelled right in the face of a mass murderer. Shoto just stood to one side, more than slightly bewildered, ready to step in at a moment's notice. Stain glanced back at Aiza for a moment. He is far from innocent. And whose fault is that? Silence. Midoriya continued, counting the reasons off on his fingers. Yours. Society's. A hero's. A villain's. Mine. Stain simply glared at him, sword swinging by his side. Look, I can't fight you, because you'll kill me. I will. Why, yeah, but I will fight, if it means there's the slightest chance that my friend lives. Midoriya pointed over at Aiza, who had given up on the struggle against the invisible bonds of Stain's quirk. Through his blurry vision, Aiza continued to stare at Midoriya, dumbstruck. Stain wavered a moment more before he replied, "Who are you?" Midoriya clearly wasn't expecting those words. No one was. I thought you said you already knew. That I do, Izuku Midoriya, Stain said in his menacing tone, his grip on his sword strengthening. Shoto noticed, his eyes crawled across the ground. But tell me, who are you? Midoriya seemed confused for a moment. Aiza could tell from the way he held himself. Eventually, he summoned up the strength to reply, "I'm nobody," he said. "Quirkless and useless and nobody." Midoriya. Shoto started. Yes, it was definitely Shoto. Midoriya raised a hand to stop him as he continued to speak, "And that's why I can make a difference. Why I can raise the ground level. Because if I can do it, anyone can. I can make heroes look human, make villains look like victims. I'll prove that those titles are arbitrary. Heroes can be villains, villains can be heroes. But do you know what? You don't apply, you're not a hero, not by any stretch of the word. Let my friend go." For a second, Aiza really thought he might. But that moment passed. No. Stain charged. Shoto skidded in front of Midoriya and sent a wall of ice in Stain's direction, something that the villain smashed in an instant with a swing of his blade. Shoto pushed Midoriya away as he sent up another pillar of ice. Stain leapt from it, pushed off the wall, and slammed into Shoto's chest. Midoriya cried out as Shoto's head hit the ground, and the spikes on Stain's shoes dug into his shoulder. But the fight was far from over. As Aiza desperately reached forwards for his glasses, his fingers brushing against the ends as every fiber fought against his movement, he could just see the battle through the broken glass on the floor. With gritted teeth, Shoto yelled out and sent a torrent of flame at his attacker. Stain leapt back, the spikes ripping painfully away from Shoto's shoulder as his fire licked his own wounds. But before either could make another move, out of nowhere, Midoriya barreled into Stain's side, punching at his arm, the closest thing to him. Aiza thought it had been simply a desperate attempt to save Shoto, but he soon realized it was more calculated than that. Stain was forced to dodge another wave of Shoto's ice, and the impact Midoriya had delivered loosened his hold on that sword of his. It was tossed high in the air. Aiza almost had to tear away his gaze as the weapon came spinning back down towards his friend, but Midoriya caught it, shifted his stance, and pointed the sword back at Stain with a gaze as sharp as the blade he held. "Impressive," Stain leered. He pulled a knife from his boot and tossed it at Midoriya. Shoto realized just a little too late to block it with his ice. Aiza couldn't see what happened because of that ice, but Midoriya must have either dodged or deflected, because as he vaulted over the ice wall, he appeared unscathed. In the meantime, Stain had drawn another blade from the many on his person. This was no sword but was certainly long enough to fight Midoriya. The two clashed with the sound of clanging metal. Midoriya deflected and parried, but it was clear that Stain was far more advanced. Shoto knew this too, and stepped in at any point he could, burning Stain and forcing barriers between them. They were pushing him back with frantic attacks from all sides, getting closer to Aiza. A lump of ice was tossed in his direction. Aiza instinctively flinched and moved out of its trajectory. This was when he realized whatever hold Stain had on him, it was well and truly over. He was going to wait for his moment, glasses now securely on his face, despite being cracked and barely usable, but something changed. Stain clearly became frustrated with this fight. He kicked Midoriya back and in a flash, he was in front of Shoto. He drew a second knife and drove it into his shoulder before anyone could do a thing. In seconds, Stain had that blood on the tip of his tongue, and Shoto was frozen on the ground, shocked and unable to move. No! Aiza cried out as he leapt to his feet. With a boost of his engines, he flew at Stain with a speed that he couldn't possibly match, but it didn't matter, for he had prepared. Aiza's cry was just enough warning for him to toss another blade blindly in his direction. It made its mark, digging into Aiza's arm, but that didn't stop Aiza from kicking the man around the head with all the force he could muster. The two fell to the ground. For a moment, Aiza was convinced Stain had been knocked unconscious, but luck wasn't on his side. Aiza hadn't had time to power his kick with his engines too, and although he was clearly disorientated, Stain was still up and fighting. The way he held his shoulder was abnormal, however. As Aiza clenched his eyes shut and ripped out the blade in his own arm, he realized he hadn't managed to kick his head at all but had missed and likely dislocated the villain's shoulder. Midoriya jumped in whilst he had the chance, actually managing to nick Stain's skin. "Don't let him taste your blood, Aiza," he instructed as Stain pushed him back again with a slash of his knife. "That's his quirk, he'll paralyze you." Of course, Aiza already knew this, but neither Shoto nor Midoriya could have. Stain voiced Aiza's thoughts immediately after. Smart kid, and the two were locked in combat again. Aiza knew that without Shoto helping him, Midoriya would be defeated quickly. Even in the discipline he'd begun to excel most at, he still lacked the training to fight someone so advanced. Despite his injuries, Aiza ran back at Stain, making sure to toss the blooded knife as far away as he could. Stain cut a gash in Midoriya's hoodie, whether or not it grazed the skin was unclear. Aiza pressed forwards and slammed into Stain's side with far more power than Midoriya had earlier. He was knocked to the ground but was up again in an instant. "Behind you!" Shoto yelled, still unable to move. Stain had darted between the icy remains of Shoto's previous attacks, only to remerge behind Aiza and Midoriya. He swung that longer blade at Midoriya, aiming for the wrist that gripped his sword. In a burst of speed, Aiza was able to push him out of range, but the knife drove into his bad arm once again. The united cries of Midoriya and Shoto filled his ears, his own lost to his breath. The tears that fell down his cheeks were more of frustration than of pain, as he fell to the ground once more, paralyzed. He couldn't see the end of the fight, but he could hear it, the clashing of blades. It lasted longer than he could have expected. By the time that Midoriya stumbled back into his view, the sword was back in Stain's hands, and it was pointing right at his friend's neck. Silence filled the alley, broken only by their own heavy breathing. Midoriya had his hands raised slightly in surrender, his back against a wall. He had nothing to defend himself with, no chance of stopping Stain now. After a moment, Stain spoke. "One's character doesn't change so quickly," he said. "Your friend hunted me down to kill me. Today, he did it again. Following you, he would become another fake, no matter how hard you try. No true hero should act out of revenge. If he was ready to be a hero, then he would have already graduated Class A," Midoriya almost whispered. Aiza simply stared, watching Midoriya's eyes flicker towards him through cracked lenses. "But we're not ready," he continued. "Just like our teacher said. We'll only be ready when we really understand why we're here, and not all of us do. Is that really enough to warrant his death?" Aiza could see Stain's smile. "Your words are sharp," the hero killer told Midoriya. "Your skills need sharpening." The tip of the sword was pressing right on Midoriya's skin now. He didn't dare look at it, his eyes focused on the deadly villain before him. "For that, class president, I will let you and your friend live." Aiza breathed a shaky sigh of relief, but he was all too aware he may have just been referring to Midoriya and Shoto. His fears were quickly confirmed, but I will be finishing my work here, today. The young ingenium shall die. And without further warning, two actions occurred in immediate subsequence. Midoriya punched Stain in the gut, ducking and hitting the side of Stain's wrist harshly with his other hand to bat the sword out of the way. The movement was so sudden that Stain couldn't have possibly countered it. The second action was Shoto's. Far quicker than Itza had recovered, he leapt to his feet and sent another barrage of ice at Stain's back. Midoriya ducked and rolled out of the way. As Stain was hit by the full power of the ice, Midoriya was just able to twist his wrist and yank that sword away once more. With Stain temporarily immobilized, Shoto and Midoriya quickly came to the same conclusion: run. I'll get Itza, Shoto announced. He charged over, bent down, and lifted Itza up, resting Itza's good arm over his shoulders. No, Itza said weakly, trying to convince them to leave him behind. Shut up, Shoto hissed, and Itza didn't dare utter another word. Midoriya was behind them as Shoto tried to get Itza away as quickly as they could. Their unspoken plan must have been to make it to the main street, where a hero might be around to come to their aid. Stain yelled out in frustration not far behind them, desperately trying to get out of the ice. Itza knew they didn't have long. Where's Dabi? Midoriya asked Shoto. I don't know. Dabi. Itza repeated, his mouth almost too numb with paralysis to form the words. I thought he was right behind us, Midoriya muttered, glancing over behind him as they turned a corner. Well, I'd really rather not run into him right now, Shoto muttered bitterly. Considering how well that last interaction went, I don't think he'd think twice before cremating either of you. Itza noted Midoriya's hesitancy but didn't comment on it. Anyway, Shoto breathed, we need to get as far away from here as possible before. There was a distant cry and the obvious shattering of ice. That. Midoriya stammered. That. Stain skidded around the corner. Midoriya stood ready with his stolen sword, Shoto ready to protect Itza at a moment's notice. Stain stood up straight, eyes wide and manic. Fine, he hissed, die. Itza clenched his eyes shut as the villain charged. He knew this would be the end. But it wasn't. Stain never reached Itza, nor Midoriya, nor Shoto. For out of the blue, from no feasible direction, came someone Itza had never seen before, in a great, tattered, red cape. Lemillion! Midoriya exclaimed as the hero copied his earlier movement and punched Stain in the gut with far greater strength, a crackle of yellow lightning behind the punch. Stain was tossed across the alley, tumbling to the ground. Are you okay? Lemillion called back. I'm fine. Midoriya replied, but Shoto and Itza aren't. Stain has a paralysis quirk, you can't let him taste your blood. But the explanation didn't come quick enough. A blade had already been tossed at the young hero. It sunk into his arm. Actually, no, it went right through his arm. Not injuring it, simply passing through, as though it were not there at all. The knife was lost amongst a collection of bin bags to their left. Stain stared for a moment, confused, and soon came to the profound realization that this particular hero was not one that could fall victim to his blades. Stay there, Lemillion ordered as he made his charge at Stain. Itza would have wanted to watch the fight, but Shoto lay him down on the ground, facing away from the action. Is it just your arm? He asked. Yes, he replied shakily. And you? I'm fine. Midoriya. Midoriya was staring at the battle between Stain and Lemillion. From the sound of it, it was an intense one. Midoriya. I am good. Good. Without warning, Itza felt himself begin to cry. Itza. Midoriya gasped, kneeling down in front of him, are you sure you're okay? Why did you come after me? He sobbed, feeling so stupid, breaking down like this. Because you needed someone to, he said, as though it were obvious. You could have died. The fault of life. I am serious, Midoriya. So am I. That's the difference, Shoto perked up. Midoriya blinked. That's the difference between you and Dabi. For the first time in a while, Itza looked up at Shoto and saw him smile. He kept smiling, and said, you came after me. For a moment there, they forgot there was still a psychopathic murderer on their tail. He slipped past Lemillion for just a moment, but a moment could have been just enough. Midoriya reacted before Shoto could. He blocked Stain's blade with his own, he didn't have the strength to hold it back for long, but it didn't matter. Shoto stepped in next, for once, choosing fire over ice to push Stain back. He was forced to leap away from the flames, and between him and Aiza, right from underneath the ground, Lemillion seemingly teleported. With a final, powered punch, this time making its mark around the villain's head, Stain fell to the ground, unconscious. They were all silent for a moment more. Stain had been defeated. How did you find me? Midoriya finally asked. Lemillion took a second to catch his breath. Phone, he explained. He drew his own from his pocket. Took the liberty to make your phone send mine its location when we were back on the train. I didn't think you'd let me if I asked. Midoriya bit his lip. Yeah, that was probably a good idea. Aiza didn't know the context, but it was clear that whoever this was, Midoriya had traveled to Hosu with him. But he seemed to trust the hero, so Aiza did too. Now what? Voiced Shoto. They'd take Stain to the proper authorities first. In the rubbish, Shoto managed to find a length of rope, with which he helped Lemillion tie Stain up with. Midoriya removed all the weapons from his person and laid them out in the alley as Aiza recovered from his paralysis. As soon as he had, Midoriya delved into his rucksack, which he'd been wearing this entire time, and revealed a small first aid kit. Lemillion laughed at the sight of it and pointed out that he had his own on his utility both. Using material from both, Aiza's and Shoto's arms were quickly cleaned and wrapped with bandages. Midoriya put a small plaster on the cut on his arm, but that was the only injury he received, except from maybe some invisible bruises. They moved all of the stuff in Shoto's backpack into Midoriya's and used the now empty bag to stash away Stain's weapons. Midoriya held the sword as Lemillion dragged Stain's bound body along behind them as they walked to the main street. I sent out a distress call, Lemillion explained. There should be some heroes on the lookout for us. Once we reach the main street, I'll send a proper location. Then, it's probably best you three have a checkup at a local hospital. Those wounds look deep. I'm fine, Shoto shrugged. Aiza wasn't so sure about himself. Are you sure? Lemillion asked Shoto directly this time. You gave everyone quite the fright, disappearing like that. Shoto didn't reply, so Midoriya did for him. We left Dabi behind somewhere before we ran into Stain, he explained. I thought he'd follow us, but he just vanished. He's probably with the League, Shoto said angrily. Maybe the warp guy took him away when he couldn't find us, Midoriya suggested. I don't know, don't care. What the hell? Dabi exclaimed. Let me go after Shoto. You were taking too long, Shigaraki hissed. He had ordered Kurogiri to teleport him to where Dabi was. They'd found him running through the back alleys of Hosu on some kind of wild goose chase. You wanted me to work with you to get Shoto, this is the entire point, the scarred villain snapped. We'll find him, it's not like he has anywhere to go. Shigaraki retorted. Dabi was furious, the smell of smoke hissing from his burnt fingertips. See, if you listened, you'd know that was wrong. That bloody kid, Midoriya, I didn't think he'd actually go with him. Shigaraki furrowed his brow. Oh, this was an interesting development. Izuku Midoriya. The Class 1A president, Dabi growled. Chased us all the way to Hosu. And he's with Shoto. Oh, it worked. Dabi rolled his eyes and ignored him, heard some kind of yell and went running after it. And if you'd let me go, I might be able to find them. But they'd already left the area. After some argument, Shigaraki had ordered Kurogiri to take them all back onto the rooftops, ignoring his warnings. They'd been back and forth at this conversation for a while now, but this was the first time any mention of Midoriya had appeared. Kurogiri, bring a Nomu to me. Shigaraki, the Nomu are. I don't care. Bring me the winged one. And he did. The winged beast landed on the rooftop beside them. Dabi didn't flinch at its arrival but stared at it with some disgust. It would only answer to Shigaraki, bring me Todoroki and Midoriya, Shigaraki ordered. If Shoto wants to be with his friend then we'll simply have to accommodate them both. Dabi almost grinned as the Nomu took off with an inhuman screech, soaring over the rooftops in search of the two. He may be a pest, Dabi spoke up, but that Midoriya kid really is something. Shigaraki didn't reply, but he wholeheartedly agreed. Midoriya. Shoto cried out. They'd reached the main street. There were a couple of paramedics tending to his wounds, and professional heroes had arrived to detain the hero killer. Lemillion turned out to be a third-year hero course student at UA, one who'd been patrolling Midoriya's neighborhood when he saw Midoriya climb out his window and bolted towards the train station. He'd been unable to catch the train he was on, but quickly followed in the train after. What didn't add up was what he'd said about tracking Midoriya's phone. Shoto soon realized the whole truth wasn't being told here, but he knew better than to speak up. He'd been sitting there, fearing the inevitable arrival of his father, when one of the beasts he was supposed to be fighting swooped in from the sky and grasped Midoriya in its claws, just before he was able to hand Stain's sword over to the police. Pushing away the paramedics, Shoto ran after it. In the background, he could just hear the other heroes cry out, but they were held back by Stain, who suddenly began to fight against his capture in the distraction the Nomu had caused. Lemillion caught up quickly. "Stay back, Shoto," he yelled as he leapt up into the sky to fight the Nomu. Shoto obviously ignored him, but he did skid to a halt when that Nomu disappeared in a flash of purple light, Midoriya along with it. Lemillion landed beside Shoto, just as shocked as he was. "Where did it go?" Lemillion gaped. But Shoto recognized that light, Kurogiri. What? He would have explained more, but he didn't have time. Before he knew it, that Nomu had reappeared, without Midoriya. This time, it was Shoto in its claws. It climbed high into the sky. Lemillion sunk into the ground so he could leap up in pursuit. Shoto knew he could easily fight against this monstrous bird, but he wasn't going to. This was the only way he could go after Midoriya. The portal reopened before Lemillion could reach them, and soon swallowed them whole. Shoto hit the ground harshly. He lay there for a moment before slowly getting to his feet. The order to get up was what made him do so slowly. Dabi glared at him. Shoto ignored him and stepped to the side to stand in front of Midoriya, who still had Stain's sword. Finally, Shigaraki sighed. "I've been wanting to talk to you two for so long now." "We don't care about what you have to say," Midoriya growled, stepping away from Shoto's protection and holding that sword firmly. They stood next to each other, facing the three villains defiantly. The winged Nomu circled above their heads. Shigaraki laughed. "I think we'd all get along so well if you gave us the chance. We have such similar motives." "I doubt that." Shoto didn't know if Midoriya needed to shut up or keep talking. He made no move to stop him. "Put that sword away," Shigaraki said with a roll of his eyes, straightening the dismembered hand across his face. "I've already felt it once today. Chuck it away before I disintegrate it." Midoriya didn't follow his orders. Shigaraki stepped towards him to do as he'd warned, but Shoto wouldn't let him. "Unless you want to feel it again, I suggest you stay where you are," he hissed. Dabi let out a huff of laughter. "Shoto, we're not against you." "Oh yeah? Yeah. Well, I'm having a hard time believing it, since you just essentially kidnapped us." Dabi groaned like he was being an idiot. He ran a hand down his face in frustration. "The two of you are so filled to the brim with heroic nonsense. Any logic goes in one ear and out the other." "Air, you mean the logic that keeps us alive?" Midoriya interjected. He turned to Shigaraki. "You might not remember, but you ordered your last Nomu to kill me at the USJ. And you," he pointed his sword at Kurogiri, "redirected a bullet into my shoulder. They were very clearly done with this conversation. You're coming with us, Shoto," Dabi glared, "whether you like it or not. You'll thank me later." "He's not going anywhere," Midoriya yelled. "Leave him alone. He's made up his mind." "And I'm about to make up mine," Dabi hissed menacingly, holding a blue flame in his hands towards Midoriya. Now, Shigaraki sighed. "Why don't we be a little less hostile to our guests?" Dabi gave him a look. "You're one to talk." Whilst the two bickered, Shoto glanced around for any possible exit, but struggled to find one. Kurogiri would teleport them back if they dared to go far, or else that Nomu would strike. They were well and truly stuck, and it was all Shoto's fault. But sometimes, help can come from the most unlikely of places. With a cry, that Nomu was struck down from the air. It crashed into the rooftop with a knife in its eye, a very familiar knife. Shoto gasped as Stain leapt onto the rooftop from the one next door. A second knife met Shigaraki's shoulder, and Dabi sent a wall of blue flame between the League, Stain, and the two UA students. Shoto pulled Midoriya to the edge of the rooftop, as far away from the fight as they could get without risking jumping. For some reason, Stain didn't seem to be after them. Shigaraki had been paralyzed. Kurogiri stood over him and deflected any blows sent in his direction. The main fight was between Dabi and Stain, which involved a lot of fire that Shoto blocked with his ice, all of which quickly melted. "We're not against you," Dabi yelled as he dodged another attack. "I am not against you," Stain replied as he ducked and rolled under deadly fire, hotter than Endeavor's himself. His injuries were apparent, yet he still fought. "I am against the League. We have the same goals. Then teach their true meanings to Shigaraki," Stain cried. "And leave the kids be." The two were at a stalemate, staring each other down. "You don't know anything about me and Shoto," Dabi snarled. "They have a future," Shoto actually heard the hero killer say, "and it is not with the League." Dabi's gaze flickered around him, to Shigaraki and Kurogiri, to Stain, to Midoriya and Shoto, who shifted into a fighting stance the moment he did. His expression softened for a moment. With it, Shoto felt his doubt creep back. "Kurogiri, get us out of here," Dabi ordered. The warp villain didn't hesitate. Shoto's brother disappeared into a dark, violet abyss, his chance gone, decision made. Stain turned back to them. The three of them stood prepared to fight for a moment more, although, Stain knew he couldn't win, not in his condition. He fell to the ground, blood dripping from his mouth, painful burns across his skin and clothing, and once again lost consciousness. Midoriya and Shoto exchanged glances. They were left on the rooftop with the dead Nomu and an unconscious Stain. "What just happened?" Midoriya asked shakily, almost smiling in his confusion. Shoto heard the roar of a helicopter draw closer, shouts of heroes as they ran along the streets below. He grabbed Midoriya's arm. "We need to get out of here." What? "Drop the sword, we need to go." Midoriya did as he was told, dropping the sword between Stain and the Nomu as Shoto led him to the fire escape that Shigaraki had been standing in front of before, blocking their path. Midoriya carefully stepped around the small pool of his blood before thundering down the staircase behind Shoto. Once they were on the ground, Shoto led him deeper into the city, as far away from the action as they could get. There were still two more Nomu on the loose, and Stain or the League could return at any second. "Shoto," Midoriya started. "Shoto." He skidded to a halt. Breathing heavily, Midoriya reached Shoto's side. Where are we going?" Shoto hesitated. He hadn't thought of that. His mind simply screamed away, away, away from the villains, away from the heroes, away. "We need to get back to the others," he insisted, still panting a little. Shoto slowly shook his head. "I don't need to go to the hospital, that paramedic already gave me sticks, remember? You were gushing over her quirk." Midoriya pushed him playfully. "I was not." "Yes, you were," Shoto grinned. Midoriya waved the matter off. "Itsu's probably worried about us. And Lemillion too." Shoto wasn't sure what to say. For some reason, this was enough for Midoriya to understand. "You don't want to go back, do you?" Shoto looked to the darkened streets, and then back to Midoriya. He was still wordless, for what could he possibly say? Even he didn't know what he was doing. "You don't want to go back to your dad," Midoriya guessed. Shoto nodded, realizing this was the problem. Midoriya exhaled deeply, thinking this over. He glanced around, and his eyes settled on something which made him grin. Shoto frowned and followed his gaze. Not far away, was the bridge that supported the train tracks. Midoriya pointed up at it, "Then follow me," and he turned on his heel and ran towards it. He wavered for a moment more, then made up his mind, and ran after his friend. Midoriya led him along the roads underneath the bridge. It wasn't long before they found their way to the end of it and charged up the stairs to the train station. No words between them were exchanged when Midoriya delved through his backpack and pulled out 2 return tickets to his hometown and handed one to Shoto. They pulled up their hoods, used the tickets to get on the bullet train, and off they went. Midoriya disabled the tracking ability on his phone, and messaged Lemillion to say that they were on their way back. Lemillion tried to call him, and frantically sent various text messages, none of which Midoriya replied to. In fact, Shoto was quite certain he blocked his number. Not long after, they got off that train and wandered along some very familiar streets, right up to the apartment block Shoto had left Midoriya behind at only a day beforehand. As quietly as they could, Midoriya unlocked his front door and let Shoto inside. He led him to his room, where he left him whilst he collected sofa cushions and various blankets so Shoto could sleep on the floor. "Good night," was the first thing Midoriya said since they'd left Hosu. Shoto sat down on the makeshift bed, slightly dumbstruck. Eventually, he lay down, and before he closed his eyes, he said, "Midoriya." "Thank you." "You're welcome." Chapter 26, Will You Change Us? Inko Midoriya opened the door to her son's room the next day with a plate of toast and a sympathetic smile ready on her face. Poor Izuku, his friend had really gone through a tough time, and had disappeared off the face of the earth. It was all over the news, and Izuku was distraught. Inko could only hope he had come to terms with it by the morning. She stood in her son's doorway and blinked at the sight before her. Izuku was soundly asleep in a black hoodie, his backpack tossed aside and spilling open with various items of clothing she was quite sure didn't belong to him, and lying in the middle of the room, amongst the sofa cushions she had been puzzling over the disappearance of only a few minutes before, was that very same, missing friend. After a moment more, she put the toast down on Izuku's desk, and carefully closed the door. Not long after, she returned with a second helping. Shoto was used to waking up in unusual places. This took the cake. Well, for most people, waking up at a friend's was not unusual at all. There are several differences in Shoto's case. First of all, he'd never really had a friend before. Secondly, he'd never visited any houses of friends, for obvious reasons. Thirdly, he was quite sure his friend snuck him into said house and he wasn't actually supposed to be there. And fourth, last time Shoto checked, the police were still looking for him. He sat up, hair falling awkwardly over his eyes. He tried brushing it out of the way, but soon realized that it was held there by a hairband that had shifted oddly whilst he slept. He took it out and redid the small ponytail. He was quite sure Midoriya didn't have any hair gel to offer anyway. Speaking of Midoriya, he wasn't there. Shoto could hear distant murmurs somewhere else in the tiny house, likely speaking to his mother. Shoto felt his stomach squirm with nerves. He hoped he wasn't intruding. Well, he was, by definition of the word. His shoulder was aching, right, Stain had kind of stabbed him the day before. He was about to leave the room when he noticed a small plate of jam on toast, a small note in Midoriya's handwriting stating that it was for him. Shoto ate it hungrily, and only then did he brave finding his way to the living room, which, kind of doubled as the kitchen and dining area. "Oh, you're awake." Mrs. Midoriya smiled. She hurried over and took the empty plate off him without a second thought. Wandering over to the sink to clean it, she said, "You've had a long few days, haven't you? No wonder you slept in so late. I thought Izuku would sleep in longer too. But his head is always so busy, it can't stay quiet for long." Shoto started. Midoriya quickly interrupted, "Everything's fine." Some would beg to differ. Midoriya winced at the third voice. It didn't take long for Shoto's eyes to fall onto none other than Mr. Aizawa. Shoto stared. His teacher took a swig of the cup of coffee Mrs. Midoriya had obviously made for him. He made no move to stand up. Lemillion contacted me to say Midoriya was on the move when he got on the train after him last night. Then, he messaged again saying that he'd been found and that he was quite sure that both Midoriya and you were heading back here. I faked ignorance until the morning. Thank you. Shoto replied unsurely. Let's see your shoulder. Midoriya gave him a reassuring nod, and Shoto sat down beside Mr. Aizawa at the table, pulling off his hoodie to reveal his bandaged shoulder. Without hesitation, Mr. Aizawa carefully began to undo the bandages. Stain had only hit once, with the spikes on his shoes at Shoto's shoulder, specifically his left. The wounds weren't deep, and a paramedic with a quirk called Butterfly Stitch used her power to seal the wounds with painless, silver thread that she summoned from nowhere. Apparently, they'd fade organically as the cut healed. They were still visible at the moment, and the wounds were a little red, but other than that, they were pretty clean and didn't really hurt. He'd gotten off lucky. Midoriya even more so, who'd barely been injured at all. Hurt anywhere else? Mr. Aizawa quizzed. Shoto instinctively reached up to the back of his head, which he'd hit harshly against the concrete at one point during the fight. There was a lump, but no obvious damage and he was quite sure he didn't get concussed. So, Shoto shook his head. Good, his teacher nodded in response. Wash that, and then rebandage. I've been talking with the Midoriyas, and we've come to two conclusions. Either you can come back with me and stay at UA for the rest of the week, or you can stay here. We're happy with either. Shoto blinked at him, hands slowly falling away from his head. I don't have to go back to my father's. I think it's clear that you're not comfortable there. Endeavor may have made his excuses last time, but if there's a risk of you disappearing again, we don't want to take it. So, you can stay here or at UA. At both, you'd be under close watch. I'm going to be patrolling this neighborhood too now, so neither of you will be leaving. Shoto glanced over at Midoriya, who ducked his head a little and looked away, agreeing to help his mum with the dishes in the meantime. So, which would you prefer? I can stay here. If you want to. You'd be alone at UA, so I can see why this would be the preferred choice. I wouldn't be a burden. Oh, of course not. Mrs. Midoriya interjected. ANUA has kindly offered to pay any expense, not that there would be any. Then I'd love to. Shoto found himself smiling. Midoriya grinned back at him, holding a plate he was supposed to be drying. Shoto turned back to Mr. Aizawa. What happened? Do you remember? Oh, no, yeah, of course. I mean, what happened after we left? Mr. Aizawa sighed and leant back in his chair. Aiza went to hospital to be properly treated. He'll be fine. From what we've gathered so far from him and Midoriya, it seems that he went out looking for Stain with the same motives as his first attempt, but Midoriya insists that he changed his mind and was heading home before Stain found him. Meanwhile, Midoriya went to Hosu in search of both you and Aiza and was successful. You were trying to run from Dabi, and so you joined Midoriya before you ran into Aiza and Stain. Midoriya tried to talk Stain down, but it didn't work, and he attacked, so the two of you acted in self-defense. Eventually, the provisional hero in search of Midoriya, Lemillion, stepped in to finish the job and protect you. Does that seem right so far? Shoto could see some obvious flaws but wasn't about to mess with Midoriya's integrate plans of avoiding legal consequences. He nodded in agreement. You all met up with pro-heroes who attended to your wounds and detained a hero killer, but a Nomu sent by the League of Villains arrived unexpectedly to take you and Midoriya away, correct? Another nod. Okay, now tell me what happened next. Shoto gulped. He could hear Midoriya still very slowly drying bowls, listening in. He did his best. Dabi was with the League. That's how we got to Hosu in the first place. I didn't realize, if I did, I never would have gone with him. He seemed to think that I'd never go anywhere if Midoriya wasn't going to, so the League tried to detain the both of us. Then, Stain must have followed that flying Nomu because he jumped in and attacked the League. He forced them to teleport away, killed the Nomu, and collapsed. We didn't know if the League would come back or if Stain would get up and try to kill us again, so we ran off. We also knew there were 2 other Nomu in the city that the League might send after us, so instead of trying to find the heroes again and risk running into them, we went to the train station, because it was close, and came back here. It was all the truth. Honestly, there wasn't much he needed to fabricate. Midoriya always liked to tell his alibis as close to the truth as possible. This had to align with whatever Midoriya had already said, right? After a moment of tense silence, Mr. Aizawa nodded, confirming that he'd gotten it right. Of course, this isn't a formal interrogation, his teacher reminded him. Detective Tsukachi will be coming over to talk with the 2 of you again soon. I know you both remember him. Yeah, makes sense. Stain was found and arrested, he explained. With his provisional license, Lemillion was able to take the credit, we didn't have to keep it under wraps. Know that if you lot hadn't acted in self-defense, the consequences would have been a lot more severe. Vigilantism was serious business. Shoto had learned that from a good number of his classmates already, particularly Aiza. Oh, right. What about Aiza? Shoto stammered. Is he in trouble? Mr. Aizawa let out yet another sigh, rubbing at his temples. Well, he didn't actually attack Stain, according to your reports, Stain attacked him. We'll have to wait and see if Tsukachi can confirm his side of the story. If so, all we can realistically punish him for is leaving his house, since you're all supposed to stay indoors. Midoriya visibly flinched again, and also his initial thoughts of going after Stain show that he hasn't improved much since joining UA. I'll wait until the week is up, but I'm thinking of stripping his vice president title. Shoto expected Midoriya to jump in and say you can't do that. but they'd clearly already had this conversation because he did no such thing. And, if his story can't be confirmed? Shoto questioned. If he attacks Stain like a vigilante? Mr. Aizawa raised his eyebrows, then the consequences would be more serious, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Shoto nodded. It didn't seem like there was much he could do about the matter, so it was best dropped, for now. Now I'm not saying that either of you will get off without a hitch either, Mr. Aizawa explained whilst Midoriya sat down opposite them, a sheepish look plastered across his face. Both of you left your residences without permission or warning, you traveled significant distances, engaged in life-threatening fights with a deranged villain, and then ran off again to come back here. The expressions Midoriya was making here really were a sight to behold. Shoto should have woken up earlier. He must have had a rather heated conversation with Mr. Aizawa whilst he was still asleep. Midoriya, according to the story you've told me, out of everyone, you are the one who has broken the most rules, Mr. Aizawa continued. Your behavior could be categorized as that of a vigilante, going out to stop Aizawa like that, knowing you might have to face Stain, and face Dabi if you found Shoto. Shoto didn't know why he blinked at the mention of his name. He put a moment more thought behind it before he realized that he'd never actually heard his name leave Mr. Aizawa's mouth before. It had always been 15. Moreover, he was using his first name, not Todoroki. It really showed that their teacher had been listening, paying attention to his class interactions with each other. Few outside the class knew that Shoto didn't like going by his last name. Mr. Aizawa turned back to Shoto. On the other hand, you're a special case. You won't face any punishment for this, just know that UA will be keeping a much closer eye on you and your family. My family? He thought of Dabi for a moment. Your father, specifically. Oh. That was, good, right? Shoto's eyes drifted back to Midoriya. He was smiling thinly, tapping his fingers against each other nervously. Shoto, give me a number between 1 and 5, Mr. Aizawa asked oddly. Shoto blinked at him for a moment. What for? Was that a 4? No, yes. Midoriya, 4 weeks detention. Oh, come on. Midoriya exclaimed, that's just uncalled for. The only reason you keep your class president title is because you know full well that if I do so, Class A will go feral. Midoriya struggled to hold back his snort of laughter. Shoto found himself smiling at the comment. Mr. Aizawa was a pretty cool teacher. He hadn't really appreciated it much before now. We will have to wait for the detective's verdict before further action can be decided upon, he finished. Other than that, the biggest punishment the two of you will face is the public's response. Their response. Midoriya perked up. Mr. Aizawa gave him a look. Yes, their response. The world saw Stain break free of restraint and chase after you both when that Nomo came. It wasn't hard to put 2 and 2 together and realize that he saved you. It sparked quite some debate. And to think I thought we'd gotten past the worst of it when we finished the sports festival. What about my father? Shoto butted in. He knew the conversation had already moved past this, but he needed to know. What has he said about what happened? Does he know where I am? Not currently, Mr. Aizawa answered casually. But we've assured him you're in a safe place. He's been avoiding the cameras, so I can't tell you what he thinks about it all. Know that UA has been keeping a close eye on him. It wasn't more than he already knew or had expected. Shoto simply nodded again. You Midoriya stuttered, holding up a finger as he interrupted. So, we're just gonna be here until when? Mr. Aizawa wavered as he pulled a smartphone from his pocket, checking the date. It's Thursday, you're back on Monday, so that's another 4 days here, including today. I'll be escorting the two of you back. You've got a busy term ahead of you, if what I've heard from Nizu still applies after the stunt you pulled. Midoriya grimaced again. Oh okay. Are you sure it's alright? Shoto asked, directing the question mainly at Mrs. Midoriya, who rested a hand on her son's shoulder fondly. It's alright for me to stay here for 4 days. Of course, she said, tilting her head to one side as though she were confused as to why it would not be. But no leaving the house, she turned to Midoriya with a stern expression. Izuku, you worry me sometimes. I am proud but my heart can't take it. Just, please stop getting yourself into these situations. I'm sorry, he murmured. Well, Mr. Aizawa interjected, standing back up. I have damage control to attend, he said drearily. Sorry, Midoriya repeated. You're going to be the death of me, problem child, he said as he walked away. Thank you for the coffee, he addressed Mrs. Midoriya. They exchanged further thanks and pleasantries before Mr. Aizawa made his leave, but not before turning around and pointing to his eyes, glowing red for a split second, and pointing back at Midoriya. A silent gesture that made Shoto smirk. Don't think you're any better, 15, his teacher called back before the door swung shut. Shoto dropped his smile and Midoriya laughed at him mockingly. We're going to give him gray hairs, Shoto acknowledged. If we haven't already, Midoriya pointed out. I don't see any. Hair dye exists. Or, maybe he pulls them out. Shoto chuffed. What? You think that's how his evening goes? Standing in the bathroom, pulling out gray hairs whilst cursing our names. You don't pull out gray hairs, Izuku, Mrs. Midoriya smiled softly, shaking her head. But you don't have any gray hairs, he blinked, how would you know? She laughed pleasantly, she had a nice laugh, how would I know, indeed. And she walked off to another corner of the small house. Midoriya narrowed his eyes and turned back to Shoto, I'm confused. Shoto's smile grew a little wider. And just with the sports festival, he realized that the home visits weren't something he should have dreaded at all, as long as Midoriya was there. Everything about the Midoriya residence was small. It was close together, quaint, condensed, and warm. Sounds of neighbors in the apartment complex around them weren't nearly as unsettling as Shoto had perhaps expected. He didn't feel boxed in at all. This place felt more like home than his ever really had. Mrs. Midoriya, who had insisted on being called Inko after the first 10 minutes of Shoto knowing her, was a far gentler soul than her son, but he reflected her greatly. Shoto could see how Midoriya had grown from perhaps a mirror image of his mother, into something molded by society, a creation that could tear it to the ground. But right now, Midoriya wasn't the weak-looking boy without a quirk, fighting at every living, breathing moment to prove himself. He possessed none of the manic tendencies he showed at school. There were no cracks in his armor because he didn't wear any. Here, he was simply, Midoriya, Shoto's friend. But that's not what the rest of the world saw. He and Shoto sat on the sofa, absent-mindedly flicking through useless television channels in search of something to watch. Midoriya was staring at his notebook, not writing anything in particular, but he had a pen that he tapped against his lip, brow furrowed, eyes focused. He was on Hagakuru's page, Shoto had realized after a couple of accidental glances over his shoulder. Shoto had no idea what had got him so focused on their classmate, but maybe he did that with everyone, thinking up strengths and weaknesses to help them with. Inko had gone out to the grocery store, meaning they were home alone, not that it mattered. The house was watched by heroes at all times, according to Mr. Aizawa, so they couldn't leave even if they wanted to, and they didn't. Shoto changed the channel again. Killer, Stain, was defeated by the provisional hero, Lemillion, alongside 3 members of UA's infamous Class 1A, often dubbed the Class A threat, namely, the class president, Izuku Midoriya, their vice, Tinya Itza, and the son of the number 2 hero, Shoto Todoroki. Midoriya sighed audibly, here we go. He'd been paying a lot closer attention to the media than Shoto had, he'd been ignoring it, as her usual. Nothing good ever came out of it anyway. Want me to change the channel? He asked. No, Midoriya shrugged, putting his notebook down on the arm of the sofa, let's just listen. It was a trashy news show that Shoto didn't recognize. It seemed the type to blow stories out of proportion. Perhaps that's why Midoriya rolled his eyes at it before they even started on their conversation. 3 presenters in clothing that Shoto would deem to be not quite smart enough to wear on television, sat around a wooden table in a cozy-looking set. The first, with purple skin and glowing eyes, set a card that she'd been reading off, down on the table. Tinya Itza is the younger brother of the retired pro hero, Ingenium. He attended Class A in the first place after attacking Stain. What do you think about the Hosu Police Department's decision to not mark this as an act of vigilantism this time? It's ridiculous, really, sighed a plan-looking man with thick-rimmed glasses and an orange-brown knitted sweater. He leaned back in his chair as he spoke, picking at his sleeves. It's so obvious the kid went after Stain for the same reason as the first time, they just don't want to admit it because then they'd have no choice but to expel him from UA, and they don't want to lose out on a hero hopeful. Is that really such a bad thing though, said the final member of the group, someone that Shoto couldn't assign a gender to if he tried, their hair floating around them like they were underwater. I mean, more heroes are always good, right? Plus, they said he changed his mind, was going home when Stain attacked him. I just think it's best not to question it. Let it happen, he's just a kid and he barely got away with his life, that's punishment enough. Huh, Midoriya blinked, startling Shoto a little. They're usually not that reasonable. You've seen this show before. He shrugged again, when there's nothing else on. Watch them get to me and repeat literally everything said on the internet like it's their original idea. The show schemed over Shoto's involvement in a similar manner to Itsu's, blaming it on him being in the wrong place at the wrong time, going through a rough few nights anyway, and he stepped in to save his friends, proving that he was less villainous than the public once thought. So, that was nice of them. But Midoriya, said Purple, Shoto assigned them names since the show didn't care to remind them of their real ones. He's been propping up all over after the UA Sports Festival this year. He won 3rd place alongside Itza, and he doesn't even have a quirk. Obnoxious, that's the one in the sweater, scoffed, it says something about UA, doesn't it? And to think none of that year's hero course could get further than the first round of the finals. They're just not up to par. UA should think about completely revamping the year group. Floaty, yeah, with the hair, giggled at him. See, you've fallen right into Midoriya's trap there. He covered that in his sports festival winning speech, said we're just looking for excuses if we say that Class B was just weak. Midoriya let out a huff of laughter. Obnoxious rolled his eyes. He leaned forwards whilst he desperately tried to back himself up. It doesn't matter, the point is that yeah, he won, and UA let him. Now, during the end of term break when Class A was supposed to be on monitored home visits, 3 members of the class broke out and got all the way to Hosuke. One was already in Hosuke, blinked Floaty. Obnoxiously threw his hands in the air, you know what I mean. Midoriya just seems to do whatever he wants. UA and Hero Society needs better control over who can climb their ranks. If the likes of Midoriya can, why can't you? Why can't I? Why can't anyone? What a good point, Midoriya said dryly. The whole point of UA to begin with was to train those with exceptional abilities to become heroes, and Midoriya is not one of those people. He's the first quirkless to attend UA since its founding, acknowledged Purple. And why start here? Obnoxious asked, looking around as though waiting for someone to contradict him. Why this kid? The reasons UA give for his enrollment are valid, but flaky at best. I'm sure there are plenty of others that deserve the spot far more than him. UA's Class 1A isn't just about helping kids which have taken the wrong path in life, it's about training hero hopefuls, or at least hopefuls for some part of that industry. Sure, the students they produce from the program are more often than not mediocre, but this year's group has a lot of potential. Why lump Midoriya in with them? From the sports festival alone, it's clear that he's the catalyst to why the class has gone off the rails. And why is he class president? Anyone can run off their mouth like he does, make little speeches that he wasn't even supposed to make, pointing the blame for his condition at everybody else. It was at this point that Shoto turned off the TV. Midoriya continued to stare at it unblinkingly. Shoto could see his reflection in the blank screen. I was watching that, he said slowly. Shoto faltered, and before he knew it, the words had fallen out of his mouth. I'm sorry. Midoriya finally turned to him, frowning. What are you talking about? I am so sorry about what I said back when I was with Dabi at your window. Oh. Because I'm a villain and you're just the quirkless kid pretending that he can be a hero. I shouldn't have said it, Shoto began. I knew that I shouldn't have the moment I'd said it. I didn't mean it. You don't have to apologize, Midoriya sighed, picking up his notebook and flicking through again. The way that he said it made Shoto realize that he'd been thinking about it, and a lot. I really do, he realized. I should have said something sooner. You know I just said that to make sure you didn't follow me, right? Sure sounded like it after you threatened to kill me. Shoto closed his eyes and dragged his hand down his face. God, he's such an idiot. I didn't. I shouldn't have. You really didn't have to bring it up. It doesn't matter. You were right, anyway. Shoto whipped his head back around to Midoriya, wide-eyed. I mean, listen to those people on TV. they're not the only ones having a whale of a time making fun of the 15-year-old quirkless kid who seems to think he can be a hero. He should have never left that channel on. Midoriya closed his notebook and dropped it in his lap. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I mean, Stain runs rampage in Hosu, and at the same time, the League of Villains sends 3 Nomu on the city. Dabi is proven to be part of the League. And all everyone seems to care about is little old me. It was so easy to ignore at UA, the attention. Maybe that's another reason why they don't let us have access to the internet. It's also toxic. And it's something I'm going to have to face for the rest of my life. I don't know if I've decided that I can deal with that yet. Shoto hummed in agreement, picking at the bandages on his shoulder, poking out from under his t-shirt. I know it's not the same, but I know what it's like to have everyone's eyes on you, all the time. You have to learn to block them out. I know it's easier said than done, but, yeah. It's all you can do, really. He didn't say anything for a while. It made Shoto feel uncomfortable, mainly because they were just sitting there, conversation unfinished, staring at a blank television screen. Well, Shoto was, Midoriya had returned to his notebook. Thank you, by the way, Shoto spoke up. For what? For still coming after me, even when I said those things. Midoriya faltered. Then, he sighed, closing the notebook and putting it down on the floor, as though to stop distracting himself with it. He turned back to him, now sitting sideways and cross-legged on the sofa, waiting for Shoto to continue. It took Shoto a moment more to think up what to say. See, that's the difference between you and Dabi, why I decided to go with you instead of with him. You've always helped, even when it seems hopeless, even when I'm being stubborn. Whilst Dabi just never did. I realize now that he didn't really care, he wasn't helping me, only helping himself, to get back at father. I can't believe it's taken me this long to figure that out. And, it's the fact that you tried to help. Even though you're quirkless, you always try. You just don't seem to see your limits. I mean, if that isn't what UA is about, then I don't know what is. Those people on the TV don't know what they're talking about. Midoriya just blinked at him, a little stunned. Thank you. I mean it, Shoto nodded, hoping this made up for what he'd done, at least in the smallest way. And I still owe you, for everything, don't let me forget that. He smiled softly, a silent promise that he probably wouldn't remind him. Shoto wouldn't forget though. Midoriya was his first friend, the only one who had ever really cared, or at least, the first one to. The door opened with the rattle of keys and the squeak of its hinges. Inko was home again. Feeling infinitely better than he had before, Shoto was first to get up to help her unpack the shopping. It was like lifting a weight off his shoulders, those shoulders being injured, talking to Midoriya about all that. It was clear Midoriya had a lot on his mind, more than just about Shoto and maybe Itza. Whatever it was though, Shoto would help all he could. After all, that was what Midoriya had done for him. Nothing much of note happened over those 4 days since Shoto's arrival, in Midoriya's opinion. Perhaps the most memorable occasion was when his mum had insisted that they did some sort of activity instead of sitting around watching TV all day. They'd settled on cooking, which was bound to be hilarious, considering Shoto didn't have the faintest clue how to cook. The idea was to make pancakes, mainly because it was the first thing that came up when Midoriya turned to the internet in search of something quick and easy to do. He thought that the less ingredients and steps there were, the less likely they were to go wrong. So, Shoto burnt one of the pancakes, and then panicked when he dropped the paper instructions they'd printed off, onto the stove, setting it alight. He used his ice to put it out, which in turn startled Midoriya, who was holding the pan away from the disaster. Now, there was ice all over the floor, and pancake on the ceiling. In conclusion, the best attempt at cooking Midoriya had ever had the pleasure of being a part of. But those 4 days passed by soon enough. And as flurries of excited messages arrived in their brick phones, burying the concerns and debates over what had happened with Stain, Midoriya and Shoto packed their bags. Shoto's sister had sent over a suitcase of clothes and belongings of Shoto's back on Thursday, and after waving Midoriya's tearful mother goodbye, lugged themselves into Mr. Aizawa's car. "Hello, troublemakers," called out a cheerful boy in a UA uniform that Midoriya almost didn't recognize without the hero get-up. "Lemillion!" Midoriya exclaimed in surprise. He waved cheerfully from the front seat. Mirio had another appointment with Detective Tsukachi, Mr. Izawa explained as he turned off onto the street. Time was tight. I offered to take him as long as he could stand being in a car with you two on our way back. Midoriya cleared his throat awkwardly, tearing his eyes away from his apartment complex as it disappeared from view, his mother fading from sight for the last time for who knows how long. Yeah, sorry for not answering your messages, he admitted. Lemillion laughed, waving it off. It's okay. You just scared us, that's all. And you can call me Mirio, I'm not wearing my hero costume. Midoriya didn't even know that was his name. He smiled thinly and nodded. He noticed Shoto silently laughing at him, so he elbowed him in his side. That's something Midoriya had realized he didn't make a sound or any sort of action to indicate his amusement. It was something in a smile, or a look in his eyes, a silent laughter. How is everything? Midoriya asked after a moment more, trying to make conversation. All good. Lemillion, Mirio, replied. Although, all this attention from the public was a little unexpected. My mentor's pleased though. He says it's good for me. Who's your mentor? Oh, just a hero from UA who's helping me out. Which one? I don't think he wants to tell you, Midoriya, Shoto told him with a raised eyebrow. He was still laughing at him. Probably doesn't want you to write all his secrets down in your notebook. Oh, good point, Midoriya nodded sagely. He turned back to Mirio, don't worry though, I'll find out anyway eventually. Mirio burst into laughter. Not the usual reaction, but Midoriya wasn't complaining. Looking forwards to coming back to UA, asked Mirio, swiftly moving away from the conversation. Sure. Midoriya shrugged. Shoto nodded alongside him. That's good enough for me. Mirio grinned, giving them a thumbs up. The third year continued to talk animatedly to them about what had happened after he took down Stain, and all the attention he got, positive and negative. He didn't feel arrogant or imposing at all. He just laughed at it. Mirio was a bubbly, easygoing kind of person. Midoriya wasn't often one to like heroes or soon-to-be heroes like him, but he couldn't help it. There was something about Mirio that just made him feel safe. It was like how All Might's smile used to make Midoriya breathe easy. Mirio had that same charm, he just hadn't shot down his hopes and dreams yet. In fact, he'd actually enabled them, sort of. That put him in Midoriya's good books, literally, he had a page on him. Soon enough, the black car rolled up to a back entrance to UA. They drove past the walls, back over the threshold, and into the not so much of a prison that Midoriya really was looking forwards to returning to, despite the tracking anklets that would soon be resecured around their legs. He opened the car door, yellow backpack on his shoulders, and breathed in the sight of the giant, H-shaped building, rising above them all. The sunlight reflected in the windows. Midoriya forced himself to look at it, regardless. It glistened across the glass, shining and reflecting the beams of light like it were a sun itself. He pulled his suitcase out of the back of the car, well, Mirio did, and after waving the hero student goodbye, Shoto and Midoriya walked side by side, behind Mr. Izawa, on the way back to Heights Alliance. The other students stared at them, whispered and pointed behind their backs. Midoriya tried to keep Shoto's and Mirio's words in mind, holding his head high. He didn't care about it, no. Why should he, anyway? And that's it, he was inside. Home for the next, well, he didn't really care how long. He was just happy to be there. It's the class president, bellowed Mina from across the room as soon as she lay eyes on him. The rest of them seemed to already be there, from the looks of it. Midoriya and Shoto were the last ones. Hi. Midoriya called out as he hastily pulled off his shoes. Eureka skipped over with a smile, pulling him into a hug without warning, and then the same for Shoto. Midoriya took off his rucksack to set it by the door, ready to retrieve in a moment. With absolutely no class nor stealth, Eureka unzipped it, took out the notebook, and wandered off. It was the first time Midoriya had actually seen her take it. She collapsed on a nearby armchair and opened it, blue pen already in hand to add her valued contributions. Hello, croaked Sue, waving at them. She looked brighter and happier than usual. It was good to see that the week away had done at least some people good. Midoriya. Shoto, called out Yayorozu, an even bigger smile than Eureka's on her face. She held a fancy-looking tray in her hands, supporting equally fancy-looking cups and saucers. "I have new tea," she announced in the same way one would proclaim that they've won the lottery. "Cool." Midoriya replied cheerfully. He'd missed Yaoyorozu, and Eureka stealing his things, and Tsu's deadpan truths. "Oh, and Itza." "Itza," he called out, hurrying over. He was standing by the board, supervising Kaminari and Suro whilst they added everyone's numbers and names back to the whiteboard, which a cleaner had struggled to wipe off. Smudges of permanent pink marker were still visible. "How are you?" Midoriya asked, spying the bandages still wrapped around his arm. "I am perfectly fine," he proclaimed at an unnecessary volume, "thank you for asking." Midoriya smiled. This was more like the Itza he knew. "I like your hair, Shoto," said Tsu, hopping up to him in the background. He blinked at her. His hair was still in the little ponytail he'd taken to wearing instead of the hair gel. Not all of his hair would fit in it, because of how jaggedly it was cut, so an odd fringe hung out of it, namely the white, framing one side of his face. "Oh, I just haven't been putting gel in it," he admitted. "I think it's lovely," smiled Yaoyorozu. "Tea." "All right, listen up," called out Mr. Aizawa, now standing in the middle of the room. Everyone dutifully stopped their conversations and gathered around, perching on whatever seat they could find or leaning against counters. "Eureka, book down," Mr. Aizawa insisted. Eureka did not look up from the notebook. Their teacher sighed and gave up. "Welcome back to UA, this is your second term in Class 1A. Normally, there is a high chance that some members of this class graduate in this week or the next. But we all know this is no normal class," he said with a hint of disappointment in his voice. It made a few of them giggle and exchange whispers. "There will be a change in schedule from now on," Mr. Aizawa announced, making everyone go dead quiet again. Even Eureka finally looked up. They knew what this entailed. "We will be moving normal classes around and limiting study sessions to fit in more PE lessons. These lessons will involve me helping you with your quirks and any other skills you want to cultivate. Moreover, we will also be fitting in theoretical and practical hero lessons." The excited chatter rose up again. Mina grabbed Hagakuru's shoulders and shook them in excitement, both squealing. Yaoyorozu put her tray of tea down and clapped her hands together. "Congratulations Midoriya on his brilliant deal with Nizu alongside many of the others." "Quiet," Mr. Aizawa sighed, rubbing at his temples, but no one listened. Quiet still, no response. He caught Midoriya's eye, and he recalled that line about the class acting feral without him. Midoriya cleared his throat and pointed back to Mr. Aizawa. Everyone hushed each other up and turned back to their teacher. Midoriya blinked at the response. Huh, they really did listen to him. Mr. Aizawa took a deep breath and sighed even heavier. Poor guy. "Over the next few weeks, we will be closely assessing your potential to become heroes. We will not be taking this lightly, especially due to recent events." Midoriya shuffled awkwardly on his feet and a few of his classmates giggled at him, Shoto and Itza knowingly. "On the condition that I believe you are ready, I will give the go-ahead to enter you one at a time into the Provisional Hero Licensing Exam. All who make it through, which will hopefully be all of you, will attend the same Provisional Licensing Exam Center at the same time in September." The excitement bubbled up again for a moment before Midoriya grinned, shushing them all by tapping his finger against his lips. The only one who rolled their eyes at him was Kiken, obviously. Midoriya tried to ignore him and his angry glare. "This process will involve examinations, some questioning about yourselves and your peers, and the opinions of the other UA staff members. Finally, and most importantly, you will all be attending a summer training camp alongside Class B as your final test. Get through this, and Class A officially becomes a part of the hero course for the rest of the year." Mr. Aizawa let them have their moment of enthusiasm this time, waiting for the talk to die down naturally as they realized this wasn't all he had to say. In terms of what happened over the break, Midoriya shrunk in on himself a little. "I'm sure you're all aware. I know you've been talking about it with your brick phones," Mr. Aizawa admitted. "But 4, 15, and 18 broke curfew, and ended up in Hosu in the middle of the attack the League of Villains was orchestrating, and also ran into Stain, the hero killer. The matter was dealt with by a respected third-year hero course student and the three of them are relatively unharmed. But that doesn't mean they're getting off this scot-free. 15 is facing the least punishment due to obvious factors that I'm not going to repeat. But you can thank him for the heightened security for the last half of your break. Thank you, Shoto. Mina called out mockingly, making a few of them laugh. Shoto didn't seem to get it was a joke and just stood there awkwardly and unsurely. After some debate from heroes and the police department, continued Mr. Aizawa, 4 will clearly not be facing expulsion, but know that you are going to face the toughest scrutiny when deciding you can become a hero or not. I understand, Aiza nodded, voice solemn and serious. Some believe this is not punishment enough, so I have taken the initiative to remove your role as vice representative. Any remaining laughter ceased immediately. Aiza bowed his head a little more. He nodded slowly, yes. I understand, he repeated. Which means, 18. Midoriya perked up. Choose a new vice. Oh, why you mean, right now? Yes, right now. Midoriya looked slowly around the room. Most of his classmates tried to catch his eye eagerly. Notable exceptions included Eureka, who was engrossed in his notebook again, Kaken, who clearly did not want to be Midoriya's second in command, Tsu, who seemed rather indifferent, and Yayorozu, who was contentedly stirring a cup of tea and enjoying its warmth in her hands. Yeah, who else could it be? Yayorozu, he decided surely, turning back to Mr. Aizawa. Yayorozu almost dropped her cup, me. Mr. Aizawa simply nodded, congratulations, Yayorozu, you're vice president. A beaming smile spread across her face as she put her tea down on the table behind her. Thank you, she exclaimed, eyes sparkling at the prospect. And that leads me on to the final thing I need to tell you all, Mr. Aizawa droned, speaking over the little words of encouragement towards Yayorozu the class uttered. They fell quiet again to listen. You have time to settle in today, and we've given you the day off lessons, which will start again tomorrow. Moreover, a new student will be replacing Mineta tomorrow evening. Wait, what? Kaminari blinked. Is that normal? Frowned Siro, I thought UA didn't replace missing members. Aren't they scared it would mess up the dynamic or something? Queried Jiro, who had been cradling her old music player like it was the most precious thing in this world since she had arrived. We've made an exception, Mr. Aizawa shrugged. As I said, they'll move in tomorrow. We thought we'd give you a day before they arrive to settle in again. He sighed like that was the end of that conversation, but Midoriya still had so many questions, namely, was it Shinso? Oh, and I forgot to mention, 18 has 4 weeks detention. Midoriya groaned whilst everyone laughed at him. Sir, please, a whole month. He looked at him as though to silently ask, are you seriously asking me that question after the stunt you pulled? You start tomorrow 4 does too, but he's faced punishment enough, so he'll only be facing a week of detention. That's all, Mr. Aizawa finished, ignoring Midoriya completely and turning around to leave. He said nothing more as he pulled a set of keys from his pocket, closed the front door behind him, and locked it shut. Well, Midoriya spoke up, being the first to do so. He clapped his hands together, how do we organize a welcome for a new member? His evil grin quickly spread to the rest of the class. It was nice to see everything was back to normal. You forgot, didn't you? You forgot that life wasn't just one storyline, with a protagonist and their side characters. Because every side character has their own story, and to them, your protagonist is their side character. It is not a storyline, more like a web. It can be hard to follow sometimes. Because whilst Shoto ran from his past, and Aiza ran towards it, and Midoriya desperately tried, and succeeded, to pull both of their lines back in sync with his, towards a future that didn't spiral out of control, somewhere completely different, absolutely ignorant to all this, there has been another story being told all along. You've seen it, if not for a moment. You saw a rather important part of it, actually. And now Shinso sat on his bed, head in his hands, surrounded by his bagged belongings, wondering where his story was about to go next. He had one more day here, at home. One more day before he was carted back to the prison he was once desperate to be a part of. He turned to the curtains blocking the light from his window. After a moment of hesitation, he stood up and threw them open, letting the setting sun pour in. He squinted at the fading light, focusing on the city living, breathing, below his windowsill. He could run now, he'd always been running. From the people who glared at him, the people who hated him for something he couldn't control. They labeled him as a villain, and now, that's what he's become, isn't it? He gritted his teeth. Class 1A, it's like he'd gravitated towards them from the start, like they could smell one of their kind. Who was he kidding? He was never meant to be a hero. But that thought didn't completely smother the glimmer of hope in the back of his mind, amongst memories of the sports festival and the shining members of the class he was about to become a part of. And whilst that damning thought of heroism being beyond his reach played on repeat, something else said. What if Class A didn't agree? Alright, that's where we'll leave off for the day. Thanks so much for listening along with me today. If you enjoyed, please like and comment down below. It really helps with the algorithms. I look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao for now, lovelies.